Hi, my name is Tommy Lynch, and I am reader in political theology at the University of Chichester and a fellow at the Center for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies at Heidelberg University. And I want to tell you a little bit about a paper I presented over the summer on Race, the World, and Its End, a New Apocalypticism. Now, as my title suggests, I work in the field of political theology. That phrase means different things to different people. So the way I use it, it refers to a subdiscipline of philosophy or political theory, which is concerned with the historical and conceptual connections between theological and political ideas. And I mean, this could be anything from, the way that notions of justice or evil or sovereignty are connected to older theological traditions, even as they are present in our political thinking today in a secularized form. Like any discipline, political theology has its key concepts and figures. And I've listed some of them there on the screen. I won't read off all the things I have on the screen. One of the beauties of videos, if you're curious, you can sort of pause and peruse at your own speed. So political theology has its key figures, people like Schmidt and Agamben, but also sort of fellow travelers, people who may not describe themselves in terms of political theology, or indeed who may reject that label outright, but are still making theoretical interventions that are of political theological significance. People like Silvia Federici or Jared Sexton. And my paper was concerned, and my current project is concerned, with some of these fellow travelers, Jared Sexton being a good example. And these fellow travelers in general are working on questions of race, or more specifically, blackness. And in particular, there is a group of theorists operating under the label of Afro-pessimism who frequently call for the end of the world. And I'll come back to some examples of this in a moment. And it's not only kind of Afro-pessimists, it is people working on questions of race and blackness more generally, but striking the frequency with which the end of the world is invoked as a kind of key idea. Now, we can kind of look at this body of literature and trace many of the invocations of the end of the world back to a poem written by Amy Césaire. Now, this poem, or the final version of the poem, which Césaire published, contains this passage, which is often cited. The poem itself isn't usually the object of any kind of close reading. It's just this one passage that recurs over and over and over again. So Césaire writes, what do we have to start? Start what? The only thing in the world worth starting, the end of the world, for heaven's sake. And it's often paraphrased as the end of the world is the only thing worth beginning. Now, as I said, kind of what Césaire is trying to do in this poem isn't usually the question that's being asked. There's also very interesting work on the kind of apocalyptic dimensions of Césaire's poem and his writings more generally. But this passage gets quoted, or it's sort of listed at the beginning of essays or chapters and things like that, and it's become this kind of very central theme of the end of the world is the only possibility for addressing the kind of deep systemic forms of injustice that characterize the world. So just a couple of examples of this, and again, I won't read out all these quotes, but you can see there on the screen, the references to the end of the world as a kind of promise, or not something which is guaranteed to happen, but which could possibly happen, and which is essential to the beginnings of something new. So the end of the world isn't only an end, it's a kind of possibility, or an impossible possibility. And the reason that I'm very interested in this, the kind of way that these fellow travelers, to go back to that phrase, are talking about the end of the world, is because in my own work on apocalypticism, I'm interested in the possibility of separating apocalypticism from two other key political theological ideas. The first is theodicy, an attempt to justify the evils and sufferings that are present within the world. And then the other is the questions of redemption. And we can see this, the way that Afro-pessimism in particular separates the theme of the end of the world from theodicy and redemption. And the final quote there on the screen from Frank Wilderson, who is probably the most prominent advocate for Afro-pessimism. So he writes, Afro-pessimism is a looter's creed, critique without redemption or a vision of redress except the end of the world. I'm interested in kind of political eschatology more generally, and how when we imagine redemption, or when we try to narrate history through a kind of the framework of theodicy, the sense that the evils that have happened in the world could eventually be folded into a narrative of redemption, I think we find ourselves in tricky positions where we're trying, in a sense, to justify what has happened. The problem of evil and the problems presented by theodicy are well documented within both philosophy of religion and theology. And so I'm interested in the possibility that perhaps there is the end of the world, which is a possibility that presents a kind of opening into the future, but which is not concerned with redeeming the past or putting the horrors of the past into a narrative of redemption. And so that's some of the work I've been doing on apocalypticism, and I think it's an open question whether or not this new apocalyptic tone should in fact be described as a new apocalyptic tone. It's very interesting. None of the quotes that I've put on the screen in this literature more generally, no one is using the word apocalypticism or apocalyptic or apocalypse, and yet they're talking about the end of the world constantly. And so I'm interested in whether or not what this body of literature presents is a kind of alternative vision of the end of the world. And if so, describing it as apocalyptic might be trying to sort of capture it into a theological framework where maybe this is something new. Alternatively, thinking with this body of literature about apocalypticism challenges apocalyptic political theology to confront its connections to ideas of theodicy and redemption, and I find that very promising.